right. Welcome back, everyone, to FYI, the For Your Institution podcast presented by Mongoose. I'm your host, Gil Rogers, and I'm honored and thrilled today to be joined by Scott Jaschik, who is currently the editor of Inside Higher Ed, but not for long. The episode today is on the heels of some major news that Scott is retiring from his post at Inside Higher Ed. So before we hop in, Scott, you want to say hello to our guests?
Yes. Hi, it's great to be here. And I look forward to talking about higher ed issues and other things. So
and all the things, right? So Scott, so for those who are listening on the podcast, you will have some timestamps in the episode notes depending on topics to help you. And if you're watching on YouTube, hi. Scott, we've known each other for a number of years. I've bopped around at a few places through acquisitions and mergers and all those sorts of things. Let's kind of start there from your perspective on the higher ed landscape. I would love to kind of start not at the very, very beginning, but let's start at the beginning of Inside Higher Ed and the genesis of that publication, and where it's gone and where you kind of got into all of this. I was joking before we hit record about how, in journalism, you never want to make the story about you, right? It's about the topic that you're covering, but in many ways, this is about you today, right? And I'd love to kind of hear and share your story with our audience for those who might not know kind of how you got into all of this and how the publication started and kind of where it is and where it's going. So,
sure.
I'll kick it to you.
So Inside Higher Ed started officially, we became a daily publication in 2005, but I sort of feel like this is 20 years that I've been working on Inside Higher Ed because it took us a while to get the money to start it. And money does count for something in higher ed and in journalism. But when Inside Higher Ed started, we were basically just a newsletter, and we were on the web, and people could read us every day and could get, informed of what was going on. But it was with me and Doug Letterman, who is still going to remain here, and Kathleen Collins, who left a few years ago. And we were very small, and Doug and I wrote all the stories, and that limited in some ways the kinds of stories we were writing. Because you had to do more than one a day.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of how we Inside Higher Ed started. Over the years since then, we have grown tremendously. Getting 2 million readers a year, getting it's just an amazing number of people who are interested in higher education, and they and we serve them in a variety of ways now that is new. We've got webcasts, we've got podcasts, we've got a conference series that is going on. We publish booklets. So we're offering a range of things, but still doing what we did when we started.
Mm-hmm. So how did you get into doing Inside Higher Ed? What was the genesis of why you started it to begin with?
So Inside Higher Ed was started by three of us who were formerly at the Chronicle of Higher Education,
mm-hmm.
and we wanted to do something new. And a lot of people thought it wouldn't work, but we proved them wrong.
Yeah. So as far as from when Inside Higher Ed started to today, there's obviously, you said you've been working on it for 20 years. What are some of your favorite things that you've been able to be a part of, and what are you most proud of? Other than obviously proving the doubters wrong, right? On top of proving the doubters wrong, what are some of the highlights for you that Inside Higher Ed has been able to accomplish over the past 20-ish years?
So a big accomplishment, I would say, is that we have been free for people who want to just read the news all of that time. And that's a pretty amazing thing, because when we started, a lot of people said, oh, you've got to have a paywall. We didn't want to do a paywall because we really believe everyone should read the news of Inside Higher Ed.
Mm-hmm.
It means community colleges. It means adjuncts, people who don't have the money for subscriptions. And we really have kept with that. And so that is probably the major decision, I would say, that is so important. We charge for things. Certainly we charge advertisers, and we charge readers for some services. But, that commitment to the reader is the most important thing, and it's every date that you could imagine. When we started out, there were a few scandals that we got to cover that
Mm.
that get a lot of attention, like the University of Colorado discovering that one of its professors was saying things that it didn't necessarily want him to say. It was about Native Americans, and he claimed to be a Native American.
Mm.
And that was the first early story that we broke and sort of owned that story. Now, if something like that happens, I just assume we're going to own that story.
Mm-hmm. I think it's it's interesting to think about different inflection points in the timeline of Inside Higher Ed. I remember it was February of 2020, I think it was, where I shot you an email from my couch saying, "Hey, I have a list of schools who are planning on moving their spring programs online because of this
Yep.
COVID-19 pandemic that's happening right now. Let me know if you want to talk about it." Right, and your response I think it was 5 minutes later, it was, "Who are they? Let's talk about it. Send me a quote." Right, and I can speak from experience that led to a meteoric growth of the company that I was working at the time,
Yeah.
because people do read and trust the news from Inside Higher Ed. And there was a direct link to the day that article published and when everybody else started moving their events online. So I think I'd love to kind of understand other kind of major inflection points that.
It
Oh, go
was
ahead.
a major inflection point for us as a business. We didn't know when the pandemic started if it was going to be good or bad for us. And everyone was pretty worried about that. But what we found is the pandemic was great for us. I don't want to imply that it was great for everyone, because
Yep.
obviously there were a lot of problems. But people wanted to stay connected. People wanted to know what was going on. And we were the only, we were a way that they could do that. So we were, we grew, our audience grew significantly during that time, and our reporting needs grew as well.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that's one of those things where, like I was mentioning, the trust people have in the content. As you've grown, how has that been able to remain, right? It can be hard with screening people. It can be hard with getting quality writers and quality content. What's been? I won't ask you to share the secret sauce, but I'll ask you what's the secret sauce for maintaining quality content for your readers?
Is getting good reporters. All of our news is reported by our staff. They're not all here anymore. Some of them are spread out, but we really believe in reporters. And that's as opposed to, and it's not that there's not good freelancers out there, but that having a full-time reporter who covers higher ed matters so much, because higher ed isn't it isn't easy to understand. Higher ed,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people do things that many people find rather strange. But we understand higher ed, and we believe in higher ed, and that is the key to our success.
So I'll double down on the strange thing in higher ed. What is the strangest story? And I'll leave strange vaguely defined. It can be humorous, funny, whatever you want to call it. What is the strangest thing you've covered in 20 years?
Well, in some ways, it's not something most readers would see, but I'll give you an example. It's a story I wrote that involved a university, I won't say which, and I was calling a professor there to ask about an issue. And the professor was a professor of German, and the professor said, "Well, have you heard of Nietzsche?" And I said, "Yes." And then the professor asked, "Have you read him in the original?" And I said, "No, I haven't." At which point the professor thought I was not worth the time. And, that's the kind of thing that can happen. Now, I contrast that with most of the calls I make, which are with professors and administrators who spend a lot of time with me and the other reporters here trying to tell their stories as best they can.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I feel like probably a pretty good batting average for you on
Yes,
people who, because people want to get their best foot forward and they want to get
absolutely.
the right messaging out and all that sort of stuff. So let's talk batting averages. What's the hardest thing you've had to deal with over the past 20 years, and then also what's been the most rewarding, which might be the same thing, who knows? But most challenging thing you've had to deal with, and also the most rewarding part of your role building inside higher ed.
The most challenging is probably when I was on the business side as well as the editorial side, is just dealing with the issues of budgets and money. Is very difficult to do.
Mm-hmm.
But the most rewarding has just been seeing the issues in higher education as they evolve and change. So, for instance, we had the Supreme Court ruling recently on affirmative action, and I can remember covering Michael Williams was the head of the Ed Department's Civil Rights Office in the first Bush administration, before Inside Higher Ed. And he said minority scholarships are all going to be illegal. And everyone was shocked. And many people think they shouldn't be illegal, but nonetheless, and last week or 2 weeks ago, that may have become the law of the land. Mm-hmm. And it's watching issues evolve, watching people deal with those issues that is the most rewarding to me.
So that is a good segue now to the thinking about the future of inside higher ed and the future of the higher ed landscape in general. I think it's probably about a year and a half ago, Inside Higher Ed combined with Times Higher Ed. What has that meant? What has that new arrangement meant to your team, and also obviously to the readers and subscribers, and what will it mean as things move on to the future?
So it's been a great deal for us, mainly because Times Higher Ed meant it when they told us we don't want to mess with your editorial, and we are doing the editorial part of Inside Higher Ed largely as we did before Times Higher Ed, but with their additional support, and that's great. They are very smart people, and we trade a story a week, and that's good. They are encouraging us to get more involved in conferences. We had a conference business before the pandemic. The pandemic killed it, and they are encouraging us to bring it back. We had 2 conferences in May and June. Going to have another one in November, and so they are looking for ways to use conferences, and those are U.S. conferences. I'm not talking about Times Higher Ed has great conferences all over the world. And that is probably the major change that people are going to see in the short term. The reality is, if you like Inside Higher Ed, and I hope most people watching do, you don't need to worry that it's going to change.
Awesome. Yeah. So let's hone in on that a little bit more, because obviously a big part of this is you're taking a much earned retirement. But for most people, particularly in the higher ed landscape, retirement is not a forever thing. I'm sure there's other things that you'll get pulled into or want to be a part of. But what is retirement going to mean for you for at least the next 6 to 12 months? And do you have other ideas or thoughts you're going to be working on that you can share?
I don't have much to share, but I'm not planning to do journalism.
Okay.
So you don't need to worry that I'm going to write another story about your institution. I plan to get involved in volunteer efforts to help the local community on education, I think, and I plan to travel a lot. So it is very different. I plan to spend my days very differently than I do now.
Awesome. Well, hey, you deserve it. You've written enough for on the journalism side, so you can take your time to enjoy that piece. As far as I'm going to ask you to pull out your crystal ball for a moment, based on your experience and your knowledge and insight and foresight. fast forward the higher ed landscape where we are right now. Obviously, it's interesting because I feel like whatever decade we're in, we could always say there's a lot of turmoil, there's a lot of confusion, there's always a lot of, right? I call it the annual higher ed hype machine, right? There's the rankings conversation, there's the cost conversation, there's the debt conversation, and then you fast forward around, there's the rankings conversation again, right? Like it's kind of cyclical in that way. But fast forward 10, 15 years, what are the news articles of the day that Inside Higher Ed is publishing? What are the headlines that we're going to be looking at?
So I think 10 years from now, higher ed is going to have fewer institutions than it does today. I think a bunch of colleges, I mean, when you look at the colleges that have recently announced their closing, there's been a notable increase. And now most of them have been smaller colleges, but that I think is going to continue in the next few years, because many colleges were kept alive by the COVID money from the federal government, and that's not going to come back. At least I don't think it's going to come back. So I think we're going to be seeing a smaller picture of higher ed. I also think in terms of diversity, higher ed is going to be more diverse, but I'm not sure all institutions are going to be more diverse, and that's unfortunate. With the Supreme Court ruling, I think it's going to make it very difficult for many colleges to be as diverse as they are today. Now, there are things they can do, but we don't know yet if they're going to really do them. For instance, elite colleges could admit a lot more community college transfers, and that would, by all measures, be likely to succeed at the elite colleges, and would be much more diverse than the student body is coming in right now. But that'll be a big change. They'll also have to spend more on financial aid. So that's a big change. And then the other thing is on technology. In 10 years' time, I have no idea what the technology scene is going to be. And look at how AI has changed the picture in just the last year. I'd be foolish to say what it's going to do in 10 years.
Yeah, you took the question out of my mouth with the AI piece, right? Because it's one of those things where, it's the topic du jour for a lot of folks, and every day there's a different take or a different article about the impact of things, and obviously, and then some things you just don't know. We have to get through to see. The only thing that we know for sure is that nothing is for sure when it comes to that sort of stuff. And I was actually re-listening to some FYI episodes over when I was walking my dog the other day, and one of them was we talked about are we in an AI crisis, right? And that was articles that are published in Inside Higher Ed and others where there's different lenses to look at that conversation with. I think faculty have a different lens on the impact AI is going to have than admissions officers, right? Like there's a different perspective that people have.
I think that we're in a real transition period with AI, and I think over the next year, a lot of it is going to be worked out, at least for the current technology. Admissions officers need to figure out what they're going to do. Are they going to require papers from high school instead of writing an essay? Professors are going to have to figure out, do they trust the latest plagiarism detection software or not? And when those things get settled out, I think it'll be calmer. Remember when Wikipedia started and all of the crisis in higher education? Oh my God, what are we going to do? And yet Wikipedia still exists. Yep. And so does higher ed. So I think the same will be true of AI, although I can't say what it'll look like.
Yeah, that's a great perspective on all of this stuff, because everything is a fire until it's not a fire, right? And it's there are certain things that we feel are going to paradigmatically change the industry and the landscape, but then in reality, it just gets folded in and as part of the landscape. Higher ed absorbs a lot of things versus kind of being pushed down or impacted by. Obviously, like you mentioned on your predictions, financial issues are going to continue to be a challenge that need to be addressed. Diversity and access need to continually be talked about and addressed, and institutions need to do a better job of that. And so there's a lot of opportunity there for the role of platforms and publications like Inside Higher Ed to persist through and to continue to challenge conversations and to drive knowledge and conversations that institutions have. So yeah, I mean, I appreciate everything that you've done, and on behalf of the higher education industry, I will represent the entire world and say thank you for all of your work and everything that you have done to push important conversations forward. I mean, obviously, retirement, like I said, is much deserved, but I think your impact cannot be understated when we think about the place that Inside Higher Ed now has in our industry, being a go-to resource for knowledge and information. So again, in all sincerity, on behalf of not only the FYI listeners, but the higher ed community as a whole, thank you, Scott, for what you have done to help us be better.
Thank you. Your words are very generous, and I really appreciate them.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it and appreciate you. I'll give you the last word. I will say to our audience, thank you for joining us on FYI. And I'm going to kick it to Scott for any final words he'd like to say before we end the podcast today.
I would just say that it has been a pleasure and an honor to cover higher education and to cover what's going on in your campuses. And I know at every campus, there are great stories to be told, and Inside Higher Ed is going to continue to cover them. Thank you.